Have you ever struggled with behavior management or relational leadership and found yourself thinking, why don't they just get it? Why don't they see things the way you do? Well, have you ever considered that you may be looking through the wrong lens and that there may be a different way to see things? Particularly if you're working with someone neurodiverse. Tune in because this is Neurodiversity Celebration Week and a special episode of the Reflective Teacher Podcast with Selena Woodward.
Hi, I'm Selena Woodward and I'm an English and drama teacher, university lecturer and with edufolios.org, a big-time reflective practitioner. So how can reflective practice help you grow your teaching skills, fall in love with your profession all over again, and help you nail accreditation and teacher registration with less stress and less work? Well, this is the Reflective Teacher Podcast.
Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of the Reflective Teacher Podcast. As always, I am your host, Selena Woodward, and you may have noticed that today I am not alone. Woohoo! To the side of me here, hopefully, is Kate, and Kate Donohue is coming to us from dynamicparenting.com. Now, why am I joined by Kate today? It is, of course, Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and we are doing a bunch of awesome podcast episodes bringing in that theme and connecting that with reflective practice and teaching. So if you're thinking, why would I be interested in neurodiversity? Well, my friend, you need to lean in because as educators, we have the privilege of working with hundreds and hundreds, nay, thousands, if you've been teaching as long as I, brains. And each one of those brains is very different. And the whole point of Neurodiversity Celebration Week is to start exploring the way in which we see the world, the way in which we perceive neurodiversities. So we're talking about things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, giftedness. Oh my goodness, there is a huge list. And the reason that Kate is here is she is somewhat of an expert in looking at neurodiversity through different lenses and helping us to understand the way in which we see the world. Now, I'm not going to say much more because Kate's bio is incredibly impressive. And I can sometimes read them on these podcasts. I'm not going to do that. Today, I'm going to ask Kate to tell us how it is that she's ended up being a consultant who works with teachers, runs professional development, works with neurodivergent people, works with kids and grown-ups, is amazing, knows so much stuff, has all this experience in education. Kate, do you feel a bit scared? You are amazing. Tell us about yourself and how you ended up here.
I ended up here because of a natural curiosity, because even as a teenager, when I was at school, I would always be wondering why the people in my class who were learning, behaving and thinking differently, what was going on for them. So connection and understanding people has been a driver from my own childhood. But deeper than that, I learned when I was 7 that I was neurodivergent. And the only neurodivergent profile that I knew about throughout my childhood and up until I was nearly 40 was that I was dyslexic. So essentially, I thought all the things that I experienced differently to typical were due to dyslexia. It wasn't until I had my own children and started to dive deep into understanding neurodivergence from a very personal perspective. Before my children, I had worked in disability. I had specialized in disability. I had traveled the world volunteering for 1.5 years, working with neurodivergent and disabled people on projects to support them to get their educational needs met. So, for example, in the Cook Islands, children weren't able to access education. This was the very first time that children with multiple and severe disabilities were able to be in a classroom. So I was a part of these big projects, but it wasn't until it became personal, until I was reflecting on my own children's everyday experiences as well as my own, that I began to understand neurodivergent culture. I was looking at it from the lens of which I was taught at university through the research and the readings from neurotypical people about neurodivergent people. So I had that construct in my mind. There was definitely things that I didn't apply because I felt they weren't ethical. So I definitely had this empathy for neurodivergent people, or this ability to relate and connect, because they were my culture. Like, they made sense to me. There were so many instances where people go, well, how did you just know that they were going to end up going down that path? And how did you see to prevent that thing? Or how did you get them to talk to you? I've been trying for 6 months and they won't talk to me. So there's all these things that, as a neurodivergent person, I could really see, feel, and know, because my internal experience was more similar. But I was still grappling with with the environments to which we are in as, say, educators, or when I've been a support worker, I've been a service manager. We have to work within the frameworks to which we are working. So for all the teachers who are currently teaching, because I'm not in a classroom anymore, I have so much respect for the broadness to which we need to function. The mental load, the emotional load, let alone what we're actually teaching, is enormous. So teachers have one of the most important jobs when supporting neurodivergent children, because of the amount of time that we're with neurodivergent children as teachers, and the importance of the security of the relationship. So education has been something that I've always been interested in. I thought about psychology and various other things, and I'm now working towards becoming a positive behaviour practitioner. But I wanted to be a teacher because I could have the biggest impact on, and it was to work with people who were disabled, because neurodivergence wasn't a term back then when I was doing training. So I chose to be a teacher so that I could have the biggest impact by relating and connecting with people with disabilities. And when we have that amount of time with somebody, we are a very important person in their lives. And everything comes back to, how do we help them to feel safe relationally? And that's a big part of where I've gone in my career, is really understanding, what does it look like? What does it feel like for a neurodivergent person to feel like they're connected, to feel that the relationship is supportive and safe, to feel like they're understood? But the reality is, often neurodivergent people are not understood. And that is because we haven't had the dialogue about neurodivergent culture, about the thinking patterns and styles, the nervous systems, the sensory systems, and these haven't been acknowledged in literature, in our degrees, in our conversations in society, in the way we're taught to parent, or the way we're taught to teach. So essentially, neurodivergent experiences have been invisible, and it's only now with the neurodiversity movement that we're starting to realize that there's this other culture, and we can't know the culture unless we immerse ourselves in it, unless we are curious about it, unless we make an effort to understand it. And as a neurodivergent person, I have then gone on to be diagnosed with all sorts of things, such as autism and ADHD, sensory processing disorder, auditory processing disorder. I've got a lot going on in my profile, and I didn't know any of that until I actively leaned into it. I thought I was, just a little bit dyslexic, which nobody is a little bit neurodivergent. They're either neurodivergent or neurotypical. We can't be a little bit and if we're neurodivergent, it's really powerful to be able to lean in to understand our own individual profile. And I had to realize and do all the hard work that everyone else has to do if they want to be neurodivergent affirming, which is looking at my own lens, unpacking some of the ideas and frameworks that I have about disability, that I had about autism or ADHD, because I've had the same messages from culture and institutions that everyone else has had. So I just want to acknowledge that becoming neurodivergent affirming is an active process, that it takes effort. It can be confronting, But the most important thing, like learning about any other culture, is to come at it with a healthy curiosity to just deeply understand. And sometimes when we learn new things, it's uncomfortable and we have to unpack our own biases because we are brought up in a world that does have a lot of discrimination against disability and neurodivergence. So we all have to unpack ableism, and that's okay. There's no shame in having and recognizing that we have ableist ideas or thoughts or feelings, and sometimes they're unconscious. And then when we find them, we're like, oh, I'm like that. And sometimes we lean into that and unpack it. And sometimes we lean away from that and pretend it doesn't happen. But what I'd like to encourage is to lean into that.
And I love that. And I can resonate really strongly with a lot of that. You've heard me, those who listen regularly, heard me talk a lot, I know, about the fact that I have a son who is gifted. And so far, that's the only label he's collected. And he's been working with an education psychologist since he was 4.5, 5 years old. And as I sit in that room with him, I often think, oh, I didn't realize that's how I work. I didn't know that was not. I wish someone would have said this to me when I was this age. And you start to realize that, like you, I have worked very hard to fit in, and I'm very good at watching people's behavior and empath. I feel emotions in the room because I had to try and fit in, and this idea of masking, particularly if you have, gifted traits, you get very good at reading the room really quickly, and there's not much of a gap, but so that people don't catch you, and it sounds awful. But what's really interesting about that is I had no idea that's what I was doing until I had a child who I've had to advocate for. So it's been really interesting. And I'm on that journey too, of learning about myself. I mean, parenting always teaches you lots of things about yourself, as all relationships do. But I'm fascinated by this idea of self-reflection through a lens, and how because obviously being self-aware is the key to great reflective practice, whether it's reflecting on yourself as a person, or the behaviors of others in your room, or the relationships you have in your classroom or in your site with your leadership teams. And so we've talked a lot this year on the podcast about perceptions and context and biases, and assumptions that we make. And of course, all of that comes from our culture. And I really love that you're talking about neurodiversity as a culture, because I've not heard it really spoken about like that. And that makes it, for me, so exciting and accessible, because it's not about something that's less scary somehow. I love that. And Kate and I were chatting off camera about how, I realized I've been teaching a long time, and I've obviously been teaching with this lens that I didn't even know I had. So I have assumptions about how my kids think and how my kids learn. And yes, I've done all the study around, when I was training, the fashionable thing was visual, auditory, kinesthetic. You did all that at uni, and then that was debunked. And, so I am consciously choosing to vary my pedagogies and my styles, because I know the way I like to learn is not necessarily the way the other 32 people in the classroom like to learn. And then I have 32 different kids every hour as a high school English teacher, so I need to be aware of that. And I try hard not to slip into Selena's fun, exciting, because some kids love my high energy. Other kids need silence. I don't cope well with silence. That's too scary for me. I don't like it. It's really uncomfortable. So I have to force myself into the, if someone gives me exam invigilation, that's torture. That's silence for an hour. Whoa. I don't like it. And I start to find games to play. Now I've got to keep my brain busy. It's really funny. And I had no idea what that was. And I'm learning about that. So I love that lens. And I think when we look at that with the Australian professional standards for teachers, we can have a really beefy conversation. So I'm really excited to pull those things together. And so the first thing that comes to mind for me is Standard 1.1, which is all about, obviously, the social, intellectual, and developmental characteristics of the children that we teach, and understanding those and being able to pick the right teaching strategies. And as a mom and as an educator, observing teachers working with neurodivergent children, I actually witness, and I mean this with love, and I'm hoping that if you can relate to this as you're listening, you're not taking this as a judgment. This is a curiosity, right? I witness and I'm curious about the lens through which teachers will see a child and the assumptions that they make. So I know, for example, that there are children out there who, if I ask them to sit still and make eye contact with me while I am talking to them, I am burning 90% of their learning resource just asking them to do that. And I'm actually stopping them from achieving what I would like them to do. And now I understand that if they need to wiggle or walk around and talk to me, I need to find a way to let that happen. And so that might mean I have to change my teaching strategies. Maybe there's less teacher-led destruction. That's a interesting. Maybe there's less teacher-led instruction. There was a Freudian slip. And instead we are using kinesthetic movement, like pedagogies where we're getting out of our seat and physically moving to an idea pinned to the wall, and then we're discussing it. There are lots of pedagogies and strategies that will appeal to different kinds of brains, neurotypical and neurodiverse. And so I'm really interested in your experience, Kate, around that. What do you think as teachers we need to be aware of culturally that are kind of habits that we've picked up from what we've learned and what we've experienced at school? I mean, I know that one I've given is a really easy one, so I want to make it a bit harder for you because you know stuff. So what kind of other examples can you think of?
I guess when you were speaking, the thing that came to me is we really need to look at what are our goals, our long-term goals for our neurodivergent students. So you talked about a lot of people will say to me, a lot of teachers will say, oh, but they need to learn how to X. They need to learn how to sit and attend. How are they going to manage when they go to high school? And that's the expectation, that we can't be doing all these movement breaks and we can't be doing things in these other ways. It's not as easy. So what we need to look at is that when we ask a child to be still or to be attentive, we're often looking at it from a neurotypical lens of, so for example, I am now 40 and I will have net walking events so that I can walk and move. As an ADHDer, I haven't learnt to sit still. I haven't learnt to look like I'm attending in a neurotypical way, and I never will, and I don't need to. That is not useful for my life. I can do amazing things when I'm moving. I can do less things when I'm not moving. So we need to come a step broader and look at why we're asking what we're asking and what lens is that coming from, because our neurodivergent people aren't going to become neurotypical adults.
No.
And often we become neurodivergent and often burnt out neurodivergent adults. And we're burning kids out with these expectations. So we're actually preventing them from becoming the unique version of themselves and to be able to learn to thrive within their own bodies. So the first thing that we need to do is get broader, and I understand context is important. Having a child who needs to constantly move and have 30 other children that you need to navigate and keep on task is hard, but that's a system issue. That is the fact, the way that our education system is designed. So it is not easy to accommodate, but it is also essential for the well-being and long-term outcomes of our neurodivergent people. We have very, very poor outcomes as adults. And all the research is stating that our health outcomes, our educational outcomes, our employment outcomes, our housing outcomes, we have a lot of stress-based behaviours. And a lot of how we see autism and ADHD is the deficit model, because what we're seeing is highly stressed neurodivergent people. A lot of neurodivergent people wouldn't need therapy and wouldn't need as many accommodations if the baseline understanding of how we function and how we get our basic needs met was addressed or understood or even existed in dialogue. It's not even spoken about. So again, I'd come back to being broader and seeing, what does this child need? in my classroom in front of me to feel safer in their own body. Now, people get a bit upset when I use the word safe sometimes because they're like, but I am being safe. You're being safe for somebody who's neurotypical from a neurotypical needs perspective. That doesn't mean we're being safe for a neurodivergent body, brain, nervous system, sensory system. And we can't provide safety if we don't understand them. We don't understand the impact of noise or lights on that particular person's system. How do we meet that need if we kind of go, but we can't hear it, or you just ignore it? When we don't have the empathy and the compassion for somebody with sensory processing disorder, we can never relate, and therefore our strategies are always going to come up short.
Absolutely. And then they turn into voices in the neurodivergence head, critics. When you said that, I was like, oh, I've heard that before. I'm too loud. I think I hum. I'm a musician, and music is probably a bit of a stim. I don't know for what word. I don't know, but I will hum to everything. I used to drive my parents mad because I would harmonize with everything on the radio because that was fun. And then they'd tell me to shut up, and then I'd kind of do it really quietly. So I really wanted to do that, and I was told that was wrong and that was bad. I can remember getting into big trouble in high school because my social justice drive was so high that I would Hermione Granger myself into trouble sometimes because I couldn't understand the world and why this was happening. And I couldn't not. I've gotten myself into trouble in my early years as a teacher by speaking up when I should, not when I shouldn't, but just the passion, because it really is important, like big emotions around things. And you start to diminish yourself because you just feel unaccepted. But if I'd have understood myself better, I would have understood why that I could look at it through the neurotypical lens and understand their perspective, and I could understand my perspective, and then we could come to some kind of very respectful place in the middle, or some kind of, consideration could be made for both parties, which isn't about shaming or blaming or, why can't you do this? It's the way the world works. I hear that all the time. I remember hearing that a lot as a child. I hear that with my son as well. Well, he's just got to do it. That's how the world works. Well, I love what you're saying is, why does it work that way? Do we not want to be curious? Why does it have to be? Because I think the research shows 10 or 15%, 10 to 15% of us are actually neurodiverse, and people our age are just learning about it through our kids often. Like that happens so many times, like you say. I think it's actually a really important conversation. And when it comes to standard 1.1, I want to dive into the words intellectual and developmental characteristics a little more. And I'll share a little bit of experience with my son. So my son has an asynchronicity in his intellectual and his developmental age. So if you look at his report, it clearly states that intellectually he is at least 2 years older than he is developmentally. So if he's 10, half of him is 10. I don't know. This is how I imagine it. Bits of him are 10. Bits of him are almost a teenager. Oh my God. And so this shows up at school a lot. And his teachers will say to me, I just keep telling him, just be a child, like you don't have to be so grown up. If you want to cry, cry. If you want to, and it's really interesting because I kind of have to explain this to them, and that's with love. And they can see it, but they don't know what they're seeing. And so there is a conflict in my son between his intellectual understanding of the problem and his emotional ability to deal with what comes up from that understanding, and so that's something really small, but incredibly significant to him as he grows in this world, because his lens is slightly skew compared to his teachers. And she's trying really beautifully to open her heart to him and give him permission. And then, he's equally dealing with this weirdness, And so I think it's really interesting when we look at that. I mean, neurodiversity is a great juicy one for evidence creation around the way you're working in your classroom. I mean, how many teachers out there have the knowledge of, that they can be different, Any thoughts on that?
So what you're talking about is asynchronous development. So his lens is different to his development. So
yeah,
the teacher has a lens of what a child develops like. So we get taught about child development and the trajectory to which all people go along. And it's kind of like this, we sort of go in little stages, and then we go up again, and then we plateau and up, but we sort of go in this sort of horizontal line upwards. Yeah. So that's how we're taught that this is the sequence of development. And around this age, these are the physical, social, emotional, cognitive things that you do at each age and stage, with a bit of buffer around the timing.
Mm-hmm.
But they're sequential, essentially. That is not how disabled bodies, brains work. It's not how neurodivergent bodies and brains work. So we cannot use that framework to understand our neurodivergent children. It does not work. Because I've seen children who took their first step at 12. I've seen children who developed the ability to understand that people are separate from themselves at 15. They were still in the stage, which is a very early infancy, of people being extensions of themselves. Yeah. Development can't be taught. It can't be rushed. It can't be hothoused in any way. Development happens naturally, but we can impact development with the environment. Now, the environment includes the way we relate, what pressure we do or don't put on children, what we're expecting of them, what the nervous system is doing. So stress will halt or decrease development because trauma impacts the brain, therefore learning. So if children are in fight-flight states, which a lot of our neurodivergent children are in stress-based states all day at school, they even come to school because of the last day and every other day, or because they really struggle to regulate their nervous systems within the school environment. Majority of the children, neurodivergent people, struggle with the environment of school. So even if we had the best relationship, even if we were doing all the right things, for some children, the environment puts them into fight-flight. So when we're looking at development, we really need to understand that, one, it's not going to go on the same trajectory. And just because it's not going on the same trajectory doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just not happening in the order or in the sequence that we're used to. So often we'll be like, oh, well, they haven't talked and they're 8, so they're probably not going to talk. Like, we kind of see these opportune times when things are supposed to happen, but that doesn't mean that we just either give up or we put a lot of emphasis and pressure. We need to find this middle ground when we're supporting development. So it's very important that we remove that framework of time and timeline that we put onto our neurodivergent people. And the best thing that we can do to support their development is understand what keeps them in their window of tolerance. So often people are like, oh, but we keep on adjusting and modifying and working on regulation, but they need to learn X, Y, and Z. They can only learn those things when they're regulated and when they're in their window of tolerance. So there's 2 really important interacting pieces to understand as teachers is, one, they're developing at their own internal rate, just like every other person is, but neurotypical people do it similar to each other. Neurodivergent people do not do it similar to each other. We are all over the place. We do not have a pattern of typical development for neurodivergent people. We are all very unique and different, and that depends on our individual profile. So we can't sort of map what Bill did and he's autistic on what Jane's doing and she's autistic. We're all incredibly different. We don't have a distinct map. Neurotypical people have a better map because it's similar.
I'm going to interrupt you there, because I think that's the thing, because they expect that, because that's their cultural understanding. Neurotypical people develop like this. They assume all autistic people are Sheldon Cooper and all ADHD people run around the room, can't sit still, completely hyperactive all the time. And I think that, and because there's this understanding of neurotypical, it puts the blinkers on and we stop being curious. That just came to me. I just think you're absolutely right.
That can happen. So we can be like, this is the way I see, say, ADHD or autism, therefore this is the way I need to respond. Or we lose the ability to sometimes ask, why is this happening? What is going on for this individual person? And there's a lot of neurodivergent needs that are not met because people are, oh, well, that's just because they're autistic. Why are they acting like that? It's not, oh, because they're in pain and let's find out why, or there's something else going on. We go, oh, it's just because they're autistic. No, they're stress-based behaviors are not a part of the criteria. We are a very stressed population. We have higher levels of mental health issues and stress, but that is because, not always, but majority of the time is because our needs are not met. So we go back to meeting needs.
Yeah.
And comes back to where I was talking about, there's two parts. One is understanding our developmental trajectory is different. And two is providing an environment that is within that person's capacity. We're often overextending our autistic and neurodivergent people by putting them in environments that are not sensorily safe. So what we're doing is we're actually we say, but I'm doing all the things I know how to, or, this is what it's okay for other kids. It's not okay for neurodivergent children. So if you're getting behaviors and you're like, I don't understand, let's look deeper. What's going on from their perspective? Just because a classroom is fine for majority of children doesn't mean it's fine for this child. Or just because an approach or what we expect of other children doesn't mean it's healthy and a good fit for that child. So we can actually push them out of their window of tolerance just by putting reasonable expectations on them.
Absolutely. That is exactly what it says in Standard 1.2, right? Once we understand that, if we can be curious and lean in, then we can start, we've got here, structuring teaching programs using research and collegial advice about how students learn. So if you've got neurodivergent, and I'm very sure you've probably got at least one in every blooming classroom, 10 to 15% of the cohort are neurodivergent statistically and may not have even been identified. If you've got that cohort there and you are understanding and being curious and leaning in, then you can use research, collegial advice. You can reach out to Kate and go and work with her and get some advice from her, go to some of her PD. She, I'm sure, would be happy. Go and check out her Facebook page and check out all the research. She's a nerd on this, and she won't mind me saying that. She's passionate. She loves this stuff. She's a good resource. That is part of our professional responsibility, particularly if we do believe that every child matters, and particularly if we do have values around reflective practice. And the power of reflective practice in this scenario is in that curiosity. I always talk about reflective practice being about having a question or a puzzle that you're interested in. So if there is a kid that you just, one or more kids that you're like, oh, maybe this is a lens that you might want to explore looking through that lens with these children just to see. And we aren't trained in this. This wasn't in our degrees. You have to do a master's. And even like you're saying, Kate, the research is often through a neurotypical lens. Although I have to say, a lot of my colleagues are probably neurodiverse and don't know it as well. But yeah, there's obviously, you've got to be okay with looking at it through that neurodiverse lens. I think it's just fascinating. It just gets deeper. I love it. My brain's very excited about it because it just is really deep. Absolutely. So if you were to say 4 things that you wish all teachers would do, and I'm putting you on the spot here. Look at her face. She's like, oh, damn you. 4 things, right? What questions or things should teachers do to try and lean into that culture? What would you say they might be?
Great question. One of the biggest things, and the first thing, is to empathize with the child in front of you. Ask questions or have curiosities around what's going on for them. So the person in front of you is the expert on their experience. Can we often communicate with words what's going on for us? No. But I find a lot of children, if I come to them and go, I notice when we're lining up, it seems really hard to stay in the line. And it's particularly hard when there's somebody bumping you from behind. Is this something that bothers you? So we can frame things with that are very easy yes or no answers. Because often if we say, what's going on? Why are you pushing in the line? We don't get great responses. So when we're sitting next to them, we're on the same level as them, and we're being curious with them, saying, I'm wondering what's going on when you come back from recess time, because I'm noticing. So just be noticing things with them and say, and often we get shut down in the beginning because kids aren't used to us speaking to them like this on their level. And they're like, what do you want? What would you? And that happens. It takes months, sometimes years with kids. Some of the kids I work with takes years, but I know that you don't always have years with kids. But you can really give them the safety of knowing that you're on their team. So number one is the best resource is the child, by observing them from their perspective and then asking them or finding ways to get confirmation if you're on the right track. And so often kids are like, no, that's not what's happening. This is what's happening. Or you just opening that space and creating that dialogue of teamwork, of collaboration from a genuine perspective, not as in let's get to the problem solving part. No, I'm hearing you. I'm just here with you. I just want to know you. I just want to know why that is hard. I want to know why you're distressed. Even if they've just been angry and done things that we often jump into talking about the discipline side or the consequence side, it's always better to start with the understanding. It's always a good place to come from because we want to work with them to prevent these things happening again, and we can't do that unless we understand what the root core cause was for them. So number one would be the student. Number two, seek information from the parent's perspective. The parent sees them in different contexts, spaces, and places. So really hearing what the parent says. But we also have to understand that a lot of parents will have a neurotypical lens for understanding their child's struggles or challenges or who they are as a person. So we want to hear parents and we want to hear their perspective because parents know a lot about their child, and particularly when things aren't going okay, what works for them. So really lean into hearing parents and hearing what works for them. The third place to really understand neurodivergent culture, there's a lot online. There's a lot of bloggers. There's Facebook groups where you can go as a teacher and ask autistic people about incidences that happen and get their feedback. Now, these are really interesting spaces that are emerging. Now, the double empathy problem comes up a lot here, which is when you have neurotypical people together, there's not a lot of miscommunication or conflict. When you have autistic people together, there's not a lot of conflict or misinformation. When you join the two together, there's a lot of conflict and miscommunication. So when we have these joint spaces, we have a lot of misunderstandings. Often autistic people are interpreted as being rude or critical when they're trying to explain how to problem solve or how to change lens or work through things. So it's a very active way that as teachers, we can connect in with autistic adults and understand the culture, because as adults, our brains are much more developed. We can explain our experience much better than when we're children. So going to your student is super important and the most important thing, but also framing things from a neurotypical lens by talking to people who have lived experience is very valuable as well. And we can learn a lot. And this is where the actual work is, because we get confronted in these conversations, because adults will point out that framework doesn't work and why, or that strategy doesn't work. Why and why? So we can have this opportunity to do that inner work, which is uncomfortable. So when we go into these autistic spaces that are freely available and autistic people are freely giving their time, we need to show up and go, this is my learning opportunity. This is me seeing another perspective, and I might find this uncomfortable and have to stretch and grow into changing my internal framework and lens. Now, I've had to do that as well as a neurodivergent person, because my framework and lens is still heavily influenced by neurotypical culture. So it's not just neurotypical people, it's neurodivergent people that have to work too. We all do. It's just easier for neurodivergent people because it's our culture. We're like, yes, of course, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas neurotypical people are going to find it harder because you're like, well, that doesn't even make sense. Because and neurotypical people have had the luxury of not being confronted about this alternate culture, because it hasn't been spoken about. It's been invisible. It hasn't existed until recently. So it's uncomfortable. So neurotypical people aren't used to being uncomfortable in this way. Whereas neurodivergent people, we've grown up very uncomfortable. And
yeah,
it is challenging for neurotypical people to feel that discomfort. And I just want to recognize that. And that's a normal part of that growing process. So embracing that will help your growth into understanding how to be a neurodivergent affirming teacher. And then the fourth one is find experts. Now, there are many of us out there that our passion has been neurodivergence. Like, I was passionate about neurodivergence before I even understood the term or that the term was coined. So going to people who have spent decades, and I've spent 2 decades understanding neurodivergence from both a professional perspective, but also from a lived experience perspective. So the fourth one would be to seek out experts who are neurodivergent. And that's where you get the really deep problem solving and advice. When things are going really wrong, you want to go to a neurodivergent behavior support practitioner or a neurodivergent OT or a neurodivergent psychologist. They are going to give you helpful advice that isn't going to be harmful, because these are the people that get harmed. It's our students that are the really complex students that the average strategies don't work for. And then we have very stressed adults taking advice from neurotypical research and therapeutic frameworks and applying that to very stressed individuals, and we don't often get good outcomes for them or for ourselves as teachers or for the community at all. So when you have a dysregulated child, a child who's exhibiting a lot of stress-based behaviours, and you're very concerned and it's hard to keep them safe and other people safe and yourself safe, go to neurodivergent experts. They're the people who are going to give you advice that's going to support their regulation to come down and then develop skills once that has happened. Often neurotypical advice comes into modifying behavior, developing skills to try and solve the problem, and it doesn't work very well. We need to come from a neurodivergent affirming perspective and calm the regulation systems first. And that step is often missed, but it is crucial before you do anything else.
Totally agree with that. Absolutely. From my own lived experience with my son and myself. Absolutely. I think what's really interesting in my experience is it can be quite a brave thing as an educator to have those conversations. I think there's this strange, and I'm going to call it strange people because I think it is, I don't understand it, but I have had it in my own culture or my own experience as well, where the idea of getting someone to tell me how to manage my behavior in my classroom, that's how I'm going to see it. There's this kid who can't behave or won't listen to the language, won't behave. And I've come up with a reason. Oh, it's because they're that kid and they don't care. And I've put the blame on the kid. You know, we've all done it at some way. We're tired, we've run out of ideas. And so we move it over there somewhere, you know. And I learned that reflective practice was a great way of recognizing I was doing that and recognizing how I could move forward. But I also want to acknowledge that involves vulnerability. It involves a bit of courage, because you're actually saying, hey, I don't know. And some teachers, I'm not one of them anymore. I used to be. Some of us forget that our biggest job as a teacher is to be the chief learner in our classroom. And everything that you're saying, Kate, is leaning into that so beautifully. Ask the kids what's going on there in that first step, you know, what's happening here. Talk to the parents, seek more information. It's all about curiosity. And of course, that involves a lot of courage. Be okay with saying, I don't know the answer yet. You don't know the answer yet. Shall we see if we can do that together? Being seen and heard is one of the most precious things to me, because I have spent a lot of my life trying to be somebody or trying to behave in a way. So when someone sees me and hears me, the bond that you will create is so amazing. I don't know, Kate smiled then, so I don't know if she could relate to that too. Like, if you take the time to ask me and not just make assumptions because you think I should behave this way and you're going to almost shame me. There's a lot of voices, a lot of self-critic around shame into behaving the way everybody else behaves. That's what I grew up with, you know, and I used to do that as a teacher too. This is the school rules. This is the policy. So leadership, let's lean into that. Is your policy looking through these lenses? Is it supporting neurodivergent learners and leaders in your classrooms as well? And that goes for staff too. Like principals, Do you know how many of your staff are neurodivergent? Do your staff feel comfortable telling you that they are an expert in autism because they are autistic? Or are they terrified that if they tell you that, there will be consequences? That's a really interesting conversation for another day, but it just popped into my head because you might have every resource you need there sitting in your staff already, and you just don't know about it. So yeah, I want you to think about that. Kate, those were incredibly powerful things to think about, and, would make an amazing reflection in itself. How would you approach those 4 things? So thank you so much for your time. This has been so valuable. And obviously, everyone, we've mentioned before that you can reach Kate at dynamicparenting.com. She has lots of different services. She can do one-on-one coaching with you if you're like, oh, hang on a minute, I think you're talking about me. Whoa. She can work with you in groups of teachers if you're curious. She runs PD. It's all there at dynamicparenting.com. And of course, I'll share links to her Facebook group and all of those different ways you can work with her on the show notes at edufolios.org/podcast. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see the episode number right here below me. So you can go find directly Kate. Kate, thank you so much for your amazing expertise and knowledge. It was an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always enjoyable.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and for opening your heart to the ideas of neurodiversity and the real puzzle that we share there, the opportunity we have here to reflect as educators on this very topic and celebrating neurodiversity in our school communities. Remember that 10 to 15% of people, both students and your colleagues, are neurodiverse. They could be gifted, autistic, have ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and maybe more than one of them at once. So this is really something very important to our ongoing community ties, to understanding relationships with each other and our students. I know that every colleague and every student really matters to you. So I know that you will lean in when you understand that neurodiversity is something that we can see and celebrate. And this beautiful podcast about seeing things through different lenses is one wonderful step towards doing just that. If you want to know more about Neurodiversity Celebration Week, then head to neurodiversitycelebrationweek.com and check out their resources. There are over 70 free webinars happening this week for you to divulge in, to learn and celebrate all things neurodiverse. I hope you'll join me for the rest of the week as I start rolling out lots of episodes on this topic. Make sure you've subscribed to the podcast so you get alerted to each and every single one, whether that be on the podcast listener that you're using right now, Google, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or on our YouTube channel over at youtube.com/@edufolios. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with you this week. That's it for this episode, and I'll see you tomorrow for another episode on neurodiversity. Take care.